And they had 5 trained officers on this 62-year-old, 150-pound man holding him down. And then they let him go, and they back up and make a semicircle and shoot him 22 times and kill him.
Welcome to the Power Hour with Tim Black. Today, my guest is none other than Christopher E. Brown, Esquire, the principal attorney of the Brown firm PLLC. Now, during his extensive legal career, he has established himself as both a competent practitioner and a talented litigator. I sat down to talk with Mr. Brown the day before the Breonna Taylor decision was made. We discussed her case and also many others. Remember, misinformation makes us weak. Only factual information can give us power. Share this on your social. A state of emergency in Louisville and other places are bracing as well. Wow, what's your perspective? What do you think is going to happen, and how did we get here in this mess?
Oh, wow. That second part is a tough question. What do I think is going to happen? The one thing I will give them credit for with respect to whether or not they're going to indict the officers in Breonna Taylor's case is they did take it outside of the state attorney's office. One of the biggest problems you have with these cases and getting the officers indicted is the prosecutor reviewing the case is the state prosecutor that works with these officers every day on traffic tickets and, petty crimes and misdemeanors. And suddenly they're required to look at a case and decide if they want to go before a grand jury on these officers they work with, week in and week out. My understanding is they have passed that off to at least the federal prosecutors. Even better is when they assign a special prosecutor who's from outside the jurisdiction. I don't think that happened in this Breonna Taylor situation. So what is going to happen? I don't know. The way it goes down during these grand jury hearings is the prosecutor's presenting the case. The prosecutor presents an expert witness that they use all the time. And you can imagine how easy it is to not get an indictment. So depending on how the federal prosecutor handles it, you got to hope that he's sufficiently firewalled off or, doesn't have a relationship with the officers, and he's able to present a case in an objective manner, and we'll see how this thing turns out.
Your folks are so skeptical, and I'm skeptical as well, Mr. Brown, that there will be an indictment in this case. I mean, I've heard people criticizing the family for taking the $12 million. I don't know what they expected them to do, turn down the money and also have a shot in the dark case where they may or may not get an indictment. I mean, there's got to be some level of responsibility for the state, and not only the state, but these officers. Why is it so hard to convict? I've heard of qualified immunity. Is that the issue?
It is. And qualified immunity, if I put it in layman's terms, is basically we are not going to prosecute officers for mistakes. And that's a tough burden. You or I, we get out here, we get to a car accident, or we forgot to, hitch our trailer to our car and it rolls down the hill and hits somebody. We can be sued for that negligence in those accidents. Officers cannot be sued for negligence. They can't be sued for a mistake. It almost has to be borderline, purposeful, intentional, malicious behavior in order to overcome the qualified immunity defense that they can raise. Now, people can be upset about them taking the money. You can't. I don't understand that. It's a record verdict, at least for the state, for an individual. 12 million is a huge verdict. I was excited about $3.5 million for Wayne Jones. But we're talking about a homeless man with, who has no job and no dependents. Breonna Taylor was a young woman. She's an EMT. She's a bright young lady. She had a big future ahead of herself. And that's going to add value to the case. I mean, the way these cases determine damages is a whole other problem. The value of the life itself isn't really something that's considered. It's the compensation that your dependents would have received throughout the rest of your life. Your wife, your children. And for a young woman like Breonna Taylor, she had a full life to have kids, make plenty of money, and all that is counted in depending on her sort of life expectancy. So 12 million that's a great verdict. They got to take it. It doesn't take away from the possibility to get the indictment against the officers, but that's a different story. Now, I've done interviews and I've talked about how hard it is to get these cases settled, how they fight these things vehemently. I was surprised to see this settlement come so early. And it makes you wonder what contributing factors were that they sort of wanted to get past before they came out, because that's a big chunk of money, and to sell it early like this, it gives you sort of, I can see some of the public thinking, you want to settle the case and agree to these changes, and then go into the grand jury indictment hearing and say, well, we've agreed to all these changes now, but they weren't implemented before. I mean, that happened with Wayne Jones. They had no procedures for dealing with people suffering from mental health issues, and they imposed them after this shooting of Wayne Jones took place. So similarly, they're going to implement all these changes as a part of this settlement, and the concern is they're going to sort of fall back on that and say, well, all those changes weren't in place. No knock warrants were legal, and that's what they did.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to definitely talk about Wayne Jones and the verdict, and I'm sure that you will elaborate if you would give us that opportunity to hear that case. But I know we also discussed how typically, as you stated, this is not usual. Normally, civil cases, we don't hear civil cases till 3-4 years later, it seems like. I mean, it's almost to the point where we forgot it fell out the news cycle, and then we hear about a civil case coming up for trial, and then it goes back into the news cycle. So that was strange. Some people compared this to some type of like hush money. The fact that the money came so quickly, as if now the family's just going to go away. I don't think that's the case. What is that hush money?
Well, no, it's not hush money. I'll tell you this: that in many jurisdictions, and the Fourth Circuit adopted it, that municipalities are not entitled to non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements. It's a violation of the First Amendment. So it's not hush money. The family can still talk about it. But what it does is it precludes some of the evidence coming out, right? For example, one of the problems, the concerns about that case was the police department came out after the incident and said, oh, we had no body cams. And then these pictures showed up that showed body cams on these officers' uniforms. Now, was there video footage? Like, we won't know. It's settled now. We'll never find out. And the question is, could it have been so bad that the defendants were like, look, let's settle it for $12 million before we have to pay 30. You never know what you're going to find.
It's the typical, go for the low ball number now. Well, it's not a low ball number by any means, but go for the lesser number now. That's a settlement. What it is, right? Is not a great. You're thinking it'll be worse if you continue, or the number gets bigger if you fight it. And that's my understanding of it.
And yes, and this is the predicament that plaintiffs in these cases are always in, because who has all the information? Your client's been killed. They can't tell their story. Like Breonna Taylor, fortunately, they had neighbors, right? Yeah, and right. People with cell phones out, and their apartments are being shot into as well. But you're dealing with a plaintiff who's deceased. You're listening to the officer's version of the events. You're trying to send out FOIA requests to get information. They don't want to disclose anything. They never want to reveal the videos. They wait and look over everything themselves for months before you get a chance to look at it. And something like Breonna Taylor, where this was, 5, 6, 7 months ago, right, and it settles that quickly before any of that stuff comes out, I'm sure you can't turn down $12 million. I'm sorry, Tim. I don't know how. That's a when you talk about outliers, I think the largest I've seen was one in Baltimore for $16 million. Yeah, I mean, when you have completely innocent people like Breonna Taylor was, that's where you have that kind of a verdict, or that kind of a settlement figure. So it settles early, and we'll kind of never know what could have been uncovered if the civil case had proceeded. And the indictment can result in that stuff coming out because, well, we'll see. I mean, the officers are the defendants, and they can demand to be released. And if they don't do that, we might never see if there was dash cam footage on the two officers. I think one officer had a dash cam and the other one had the mount, but not the dash cam. And we'll never know what was going on with that footage now that the civil case is resolved.
We talked about it, and you said you were skeptical that things would proceed, that there's such a high barrier of proof on the prosecutor's behalf, like on their side, and police officers. I mean, since they did have a warrant, and they can't have no knock is present. I think it was changed at the very end or something about announce. And then one neighbor said there was an announcement. It gets kind of convoluted, once you start unpacking it.
It does. And this is the problem with the civil cases. The officers, under any circumstance, have a guaranteed trip to the Court of Appeals to challenge if qualified immunity is denied to the officers. So they can go through the civil suit. And if you're looking for, when you're looking for $4, $5, $6 million, rest assured, they'll drop 100, 200 grand in a heartbeat just to see if they can pull something off. Right? You never know with litigation, right? They think the lawyer's not that good. He can't handle that type of litigation. It's too heavy for him. They'll drop 200 grand just to see how it plays out. And if the court denies qualified immunity, which is rare, I have one like this in the Fourth Circuit right now, the officer is entitled to an interlocutory appeal. They can say, whoa, before we go to trial, I want to see if the appellate court agrees with this. And of course, if the court grants qualified immunity, the estate has to appeal. So no matter how you look at it, the officers are guaranteed a right to the Court of Appeals before they have to face going to trial. So for it to happen this early before they sort of take that shot for that amount of money is pretty impressive.
Wow. Just switching gears just a little bit, why the Breonna Taylor case is really is disturbing, man. But I would like to ask a question about a lot of the shootings that I cover are involving people with mental issues, mental health issues. And when you talk about qualified immunity, why are police officers required to have a higher level of respect, treatment, higher level of care provided to people that they basically could determine that there must be something wrong? I mean, one story I just covered, it was a man who was outside naked in like February, running from house to house, and they didn't realize this person may not follow procedures or due to the fact he has a mental disability. Why doesn't the threshold get raised when dealing with people with disabilities?
That is a fantastic question. So let's talk about qualified immunity. It's a judicially created doctrine. So 42 Section USC 1983 was put into place really to put force and effect behind the Ku Klux Klan Act, right? So when the Civil Rights Act was put in place, and the statute sort of codifies that, and it says that government actors, state actors will be liable, not just police officers, anybody who works for the state, sanitation people, teachers, right? If they violate your constitutional rights. And then the court kind of came up behind it and said, well, you must have really meant there's some level of immunity allowed here. And because we need to protect state actors from frivolous lawsuits and being harassed, and they need to be able to do their duties without worrying about it all the time. These were the justifications. Now, for some reason, when we're talking about police officers, we treat them with these kid gloves, like they aren't trained in the use of excessive force, like they aren't trained in Fourth Amendment issues, they aren't trained in search and seizure, the use of tasers, and they treat them like they're high school kids. You know, there's a pretty seminal case, U.S. Supreme Court. It's from like 1987. It was an officer tased a man who was jaywalking. No commands, no hey you, no get out of the road, just tased him, dropped it. And the court found that the officer was entitled to qualified immunity because we hadn't had a circumstance quite like that before, and therefore that officer wasn't on notice that would have been a violation of that man's rights. Now think about that. Do we need a prior case that's exactly the same to understand you can't just out of the blue tase somebody who's walking across the street, not on a sidewalk? But this is how it plays out.
That's horrific. What I never heard that one. That's a new one. Okay, so you got to have precedents in all cases in order to bring charges to get any type of action, against officers.
Well, qualified immunity has two prongs. The first prong is, did the officer violate the individual's rights? You look at the circumstances, and were they trying to resist arrest, or what was the nature of the crime they were involved in? Did the officer reasonably have a fear for his safety or the safety of others for engaging in the use of excessive force? And if you say yes, and they can take the prong in any order they want. The second prong is, was that right clearly established in the law? In other words, the right to be free from whatever that officer did to you. Mm-hmm. So when you have a situation, what the courts do is they look back and say, have we had a scenario like this before? And they try, if there isn't one, they say, well, that officer didn't have notice that would have been a violation of that person's rights, and he or she is entitled to qualified immunity. But there are so many times where you have to ask yourself, why do we need precedent to understand that this is a violation of this person's rights?
Common sense.
Yeah, there's a recent Supreme Court opinion from a couple of years ago, Casella v. Hughes. Officers get report of another mental health case. Officers get report of a woman in her own yard holding a knife, acting erratically. Okay. 3 officers show up. There's a fence, a chain link fence, separating them from the woman who's 15, 20 feet away. She's standing next to her roommate. And the 2 officers say, well, we were there. We were trying to talk to her. We wanted to see what was going on. The third officer, he waited about 5 seconds and shot her 3 times. Okay. You can't just open fire on people. The woman's in her own yard holding a knife, which is not illegal. Nothing wrong with that. And he testified his position was in seeking qualified immunity. I didn't know if she was going to injure the woman next to her. And while the courts were like, well, that was bad, but we haven't had a case quite like this before, though this was new, a new situation where you're dealing with someone and there's a claim of mental health and they're standing next to someone they could injure. Therefore, the right wasn't clearly established, and that officer was granted qualified immunity and got away with it.
Amazing. That I mean, I'm left speechless. I tell people, don't call the police. If you got an issue, try to take care of it. Okay, so what about the story? Someone's got their hands they're already handcuffed. They're already in custody, and then some strange reason they get smothered to death. We just saw that play out. I don't know. He was naked. Mr. Brown, the man was naked. He was cuffed, and they still smothered him to death. How do you foresee? They're going to say, well, we didn't know we could. We could smother a guy by doing push-ups on his face and pushing his head into the pavement. What's going to be the excuse that's made by the police? What can they say?
Well, this is one of those scenarios where you have to approach these cases in a creative way. And you have to have an open mind, review everything, and figure out where you can come up with something. For example, with Wayne Jones, there was an allegation that he had a knife, that he refused to drop the knife, and he tried to stab an officer. This is why you didn't hear about this when it happened. Everybody goes, oh, well, we're not going to worry about that case. And a different lawyer had the case, and it got dismissed on summary judgment, and it was going up on appeal. And that's where I got involved, and I reviewed it. And reviewing the tape, I made the argument, because there is established case law that once a suspect is detained, excessive force may not be used. And they had 5 trained officers on this 62-year-old, 150-pound man holding him down. And then they let him go, and they back up and make a semicircle and shoot him 22 times and kill him. And I made the argument that creates a perverse incentive where officers can have someone detained and let them go and shoot them based on the justification that occurred before they had them under control. So in the example you're giving, I would like to think you could be successful making an argument that once that individual is detained and under control and no longer a threat, handcuffed, etc., excessive force may not be used at that point in time.
James Boyd in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he wouldn't drop the knife, and they basically firing squad. They all fired on him as if, and I think he was in the hills and was camping out. He wouldn't leave the campground. He was homeless, but he wouldn't leave the park or something. It was a long time ago, but and that was a white gentleman. I think he was homeless, and like I stated, I really don't know where to go with this, Mr. Brown. It just seems so horrific what citizens have to deal with when it comes to law enforcement. So with Mr. Jones, right?
Yes.
What was the outcome of that case? How did you win over the jury? Well, the judge in that case.
I didn't. Let's be clear. I had to appeal. She dismissed the case 3 times. I had to appeal 3 times, and I won 3 times. After the 3rd appeal, I tell you, Tim, it was the timing of it. It was about 3 days after George Floyd got killed, and the opinion drops. And in the last paragraph, the court references George Floyd and Michael Brown and says, this has to stop, in the opinion. I mean, I got T-shirts printed up for the next time we do a vigil from Wayne Jones in Martinsburg, West Virginia. This has to stop. And after that, the counsel called me and said, look, do you want to revisit settlement talks?
Okay.
I was like, yeah, I bet you do. And so we went back to the Fourth Circuit mediator, spent about a week, and got it resolved. So the judge.
Okay, so the judge didn't conclude, but they settled the case because the evidence that you presented, the case that you put on, was so riveting, and also the timing, as you stated, was so compelling that they knew that you could probably get a better award. Is that what we're coming up with?
Well, and after the third appeal, they were out of options. It was going back for trial.
Excuses.
And that's where the pressure starts. They don't want to go to trial. They'll take a shot and know they have a chance at appeal and know they have a really good chance of winning. But once you get to the point where the case is going to go to trial, things change a little bit. And so we were set to go to trial, and they settled the case. And they might not be worried about the money. Look, we were going to be in the Northern District of West Virginia suing 5 officers who shot this man. And we're going to be, you got to think of who your jury is going to be. But, the headline sometimes can be worth more than the money. Jury finds in favor of man shot 22 times. How much they award doesn't matter. That's a jury finding, right? That the officers did wrong. And these settlements always, even in Breonna Taylor, there's no admission of wrongdoing.
Right, I noticed that. I saw that. That was something that really stuck in the craw of a lot of people when we spoke about the issue. It's like, nothing happened. Well, something happened, but it's not our fault. Whatever happened, we're really sorry. We feel really bad that she died and, yada, 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 but no admission of guilt. That's a horrible thing for the family to have to accept.
Yeah, that's tough. And the family in the Jones case had a hard time with it. And I tried to explain to them this. When you walk out here in this climate and the public knows you settled the case of $3.5 million, you don't need them to admit they did wrong. Like, everybody knows. The concern is the lack of accountability for the officers. Those officers still work there. Like, one of them doesn't, but the other 4 still work for Martinsburg Police Department. They have salaries. They got retirement benefits. And that's what upsets the family. They wanted to see some of that be disrupted. And that can only come through either a finding from a civil jury, which will follow them and hurt them, or criminal indictment. That's the only thing you can do.
I want them to admit it. I know I'm petty. I want to hear you say, we did this, we shouldn't have done it. My sister, cousin, friend, brother, son should be allowed to die. I want to hear the words. I'm sure there's many other parents who want to hear those words as well. I understand legally, take your money, get up out of here, do something good with it, take care of the family, take care of I want to hear them, take blame for it.
One of Wayne Jones' brothers was interviewed after the settlement.
Yeah. And
they were asking him, when this thing started, what did you, how was it going? He said, the thing that hurt me the most was they wouldn't talk to me. They wouldn't give me any information, and they wouldn't just tell me they were sorry it happened. That's it. That's all the man wanted. And, they turn their back on you. They lock down. All the information gets locked down. Nobody wants to release the dash cams.
Right.
You have to fight every inch of the way.
Well, so is there, based on the climate of what we've been seeing, well, I had a great conversation about this with Jamal Bowman, new congressperson out of New York, 16th District, and he was saying how this is unprecedented, what we're seeing right now. Like, from a civil rights perspective, people in the streets, people protesting and affecting all people of all colors, nationalities, religions. People are really looking at what's happening, particularly in the Black community, and they're going, hey, this got to stop. Does this look promising to you, or are you waiting for more evidence before you make that conclusion?
After George Floyd was killed, and they had these protests going on around the world, I mean, thousands, tens of thousands of people, I thought to myself, okay, we could really implement some real change. But it's always a waiting game. It always gets stretched out, just like the litigation. 5 years later, they know that you're going to be tired, you're going to be worn out. It costs money. People are drained. It's emotionally draining. The same thing's going to happen. We have to try and avoid that same thing happening when it comes to implementing change. Because time, they want to wear people out. The protests have stopped going out. COVID has helped with that a little bit, with the protesting that's kept up. So, do I feel like we're going to be able to achieve some change? Yes. Some of the things they talk about, is we need more training for the officers. I got to tell you, I've never been a big fan of thinking that training them more is going to make them deal with these situations better. These are basic human decency issues, right?
Right.
When you're dealing with someone where you have no real understanding or compassion or respect for their livelihood and their lives. And I don't think training is going to change that. We need better filters in determining who gets into the police department. Mm-hmm. That would help. Like better mental health, reviews to see where these people stand, what their issues might be with respect to their racial biases or prejudices. Because I don't think training fixes that. It's amazing to me that you can stand over a man who's been in a chokehold for 17 seconds, like Mr. Jones. He's not moving. Yes, he's not responding to your commands to drop the knife. He's not. He looks like he's unconscious, and then shoot him 22 times. That takes a special, not right issue to make that happen.
Right.
And training is not going to help that. We need to do a better job of who's carrying these guns around. Right. Which brings us to the issue, the whole defund the police issue. I heard this black sheriff say it best. He said, you know what our problem is? No matter what the issue is, we send a guy with a gun. Yeah. And we have to change that. We got to change. Yeah. Sending the guy with a gun is not the answer. We have a wonderful network of compassionate, caring, overworked and underpaid social workers in this country. Yeah. They can take on such a large part of what the officers do, responding to domestic disputes with somebody's kid, disputes over a parking spot at 7-Eleven, disputes between neighbors. The social worker knows their community. They know their neighbors. They can go over and say, oh, yeah, I know Tim. I'll go over. I'll stop by his house. And they can check in on it. They're not holding a gun. They're not going to be scared to death rolling up on somebody. And it can be resolved, hopefully, in a much easier manner. So when we talk about defunding the police, there's a lot of misinformation, right? I've heard Joe Rogan fall into that trap. It's not about getting rid of the police. Mm-hmm. There are people out here who are always looking to exploit and get over. And the truth is, it's the financial crimes that are a big deal these days, really. But we can take a lot of some of the funding out of these police departments and stop putting into military equipment, right, and these special vehicles and heavy artillery, and put it into what will be cheaper, paying social workers to take a lot of these little things off of the officers' plates. Because yes, they have a tough job. Yes, it's strenuous. Yes, when you walk into certain places, you can be afraid of what's going to happen. Right? There are bad people out there, but there's so many situations where that they don't need to be the ones going, holding a gun, and unnecessarily getting nervous. It's too easy subjectively under this test for an officer to say, I fear for my safety.
Right.
Okay. Qualified immunity. Done. It's too easy.
Yeah, I do support defunding the police to a certain extent. And like you, I think of it as reallocating of resources to other institutions. And I know a number of these cases where people are shot by police. Someone has a mental health issue going in play. Person has a mental health issue. They called earlier that day, they had taken him to a facility that released him. So then they're like, okay, he has another episode. And they're like, okay, they call back and they said, well, look, we can't, you had to call the police this time. So then they reluctantly called the police thinking something else would happen. They had no idea that it was going to result in the death of their loved one. So I think it's bad that, as you stated, police officers dealing with situations that I don't think they get enough training to deal with those type of situations. I will give them that. I would say, if you don't know you're going to check on a kitty in a tree or a person with a AR-15, that's too wide a gap of issues to deal with, or a person who's having hallucinations, who's 2 months off their medication. That's like too much for me not to know what I'm going into when I go out there. So I say, and I say maybe we should have for another division that's, I don't know, the mental health division. I don't know, the real wellness protection check division. I don't know that does that. And then I also imagine that we should pay, and we should have some elite police officers, the ones that are trained for these types of activities, who are battle tested, who get even more money. Like I pay the really good ones more. Get rid of the bad ones, the weak ones, the ones who shouldn't be, like the officer who shot Tamir Rice. Get rid of his ass. He's gone. He shouldn't be a cop. He shouldn't be able to get fired and go work across the street. So I know that's a lot to digest, but that's how I see it. And a lot of people in my community who have called up to the show, they kind of agree with those remedies for the situation. Did any of that make sense?
Yes, and getting them fired, that's a whole other issue. One thing I thought was interesting, in the interviews I've done recently, one of the problems I've cited is whenever these officers have complaints against them, they just jump ship. They just switch to a different department. They go to the sheriff's office down the street, the police office in the neighboring county, and then the investigation stops because that police department doesn't want to invest those resources in it to do an internal investigation to an officer who's no longer employed there. One of the things the Breonna Taylor settlement changes they have to implement is tracking when these officers do that and keep these investigations going till they're closed out. That's a huge point because the big problem is the police unions, and they're doing their job. Man, they're doing their job well. Let's be clear. Their job is to protect the officers, protect the security of their employment, protect their pay and their benefits, and they do it, and they do it well. The hurdles, the procedural hoops they have to jump through to deal with these officers who've engaged in conduct that's unbecoming or excessive force. They've done an incredible job, and it makes it really hard to go after these officers and get someone fired. It makes it real tough.
So you're bad at, you do a horrible job. I know specifically in Tamir Rice, the officer, in his jacket, Mr. Brown, they said this guy should not be a cop. Like, he got fired from the last agency he was policing with. They said this guy's horrible under pressure. He should not be a cop. Who goes right across the town, gets another position. They weren't able to look at his jacket to even know that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, they close the investigation out before it's finished, so there's nothing to look at.
Wow.
It's like you're about to take a test at school and you switch schools, so no one knows how your homework was the rest of the year at the prior school. It's kind of like that. I mean,
wow.
you essentially get a fresh start. And it was interesting to see in the Breonna Taylor case that one of the terms was to deal with that problem, right? Because those unions have insulated those officers. They've done a bang up job in protecting those guys in their jobs, from dealing with negative consequences.
Every time I see footage of the New York police union, I see some guy complaining about how cops aren't being treated fair. They're not getting a fair shake, and he's basically threatening citizens like, hey, if you don't treat us better, some things could happen in your community and we'll just look the other way. Like, if you don't like what we're policing, then, you're on your own, that type of thing.
They see out there all the time. Oh, it's just some bad apples. Like, they don't understand where that phrase comes from. The phrase means is, a couple bad apples spoil the whole barrel.
That's the rest of it,
point, right? So acknowledging you have a couple bad apples, why you can't then acknowledge that there's a threat that the entire basket is going to get spoiled and we need to deal with it and address it. It's like when we say it's a mental health issue, like the country has a mental health issue, right? The first thing we got to acknowledge, we have a problem, and we're having a hard time doing that from the administration on down. And until we do that, we can't start dealing with this and approaching it really as a mental health issue and trying to resolve it.
And you just opened up a hornet's nest, man, because a lot of Americans on medication. Like, where do you start? You know what I mean? As over-medicated as the United States is, that could be pretty much almost every run-in with the police. We could say it was mental health issue concerning the citizen, I should say, the civilian. That's
I'm speaking more from a historically systemic racism perspective, right? It could be, we should view it as a mental health issue. We need to acknowledge it first and then approach it in an appropriate way to deal with it and solve the problem. Yeah.
If only we could, right? If only we just saw people as people and there wasn't this instant fear some have of others. You know what I mean? Of black folks, maybe I don't know. Maybe we could get some justice. We would need these. I don't know. You know. I want you to do well, Mr. Brown, but like you practice of the law. We don't need criminal. We don't need having you have to take cases where people have been wrongfully killed. I mean, I could do without these cases, and I'm sure the victims and the families could do without them as well if we could somehow solve this problem. I don't know if they really want to solve it though, Mr. Brown, because we could put a man on the moon, we could put a space force, a force in outer space, but we can't get police officers not to shoot kids.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the way things are going, my practice is going national with the excessive force cases. I just picked up a case in Las Vegas, right? This man is outside. He gets a report. He's outside in his front yard holding a sword. Like that. Okay, that's bad. They've dealt with this man like 7 times in the past and transported him to the mental health units, right? So they know. So they have a choice. What are you going to do? What do you think is going to happen if you show up with a gun and approach this man and tell him to put down the sword? Like, you know what's going to happen. Yeah. He's going to walk towards you and you're going to shoot him and kill him. And that's what they did. Why don't they say, okay, we're dealing with this gentleman. He's got a sword. He's never hurt anybody in the past. Let's show up with some beanbag guns and some tasers and get this man the help he needs.
Let's throw a net over his ass and drag him up out of there.
They walk up and they roll up on him and they know him. Hey, Justin, put down the sword, put down the sword. And when he walks towards them, shot and killed.
They just got tired of dealing with him. I know that's just me saying, that's the way I look at it. I mean, they just said, you know what? That's it. We tired of coming out here. It's time for him to go. And that's horrific that they could be judge, jury, and executioner of civilians that way. And as you stated, so they picked you. Wow. So Las Vegas case, now you're representing them.
Yeah.
Now you represent them.
Yeah, I spoke to his mother a couple of weeks ago and picked it up. Think of Wayne Jones. This man is walking next to the sidewalk. And the reason he's approached is because he's not on the sidewalk. And you end up dead 10 minutes later. Like, think about that. You're not walking on the sidewalk and you're dead like 7 minutes later. Like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't care what happens. So what in the world happens that you approach a man about why he's not on the sidewalk and he ends up dead?
Right.
And, that's a disturbing, frightening prospect for black men in this country.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. Well, Mr. Brown, I want to thank you so much for taking time out and having this conversation. There is so much going on, man. I would love to bring you back as we have other cases, find out what's going on in Las Vegas with your case. And also, unfortunately, it looks like we're going to have a lot of work ahead of us. Because covering these stories, I know it's not going to stop, and you doing your work is not going to stop. How can people follow you and find out more about what you have going on?
My website is brownfirmpllc.com, and you can get info on our LinkedIn, our Facebook, and what else do I have? LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter on the website to follow what we're dropping. Yeah.
Wow.
And thanks so much for having me, Tim. It's been a pleasure. Be happy to come back.
Man, definitely, man. I appreciate it, man. We are honored to have your presence, man. And I remember the Freddie Gray story. I haven't heard of the Mr. Jones story. It sounds very eerily similar to some others that I've covered as well, though. Just horrific, doesn't make sense. People, we could go on and on. It's like so many of these stories. I think about the Laquan McDonald case where they shot the kid like 15 times. Yeah. And he had a pocket knife. Ooh, scary pocket knife the kid had. So, I wish I'd have known you then. I'd have definitely brought you in for some legal expertise to go along with my ranting, because I can use you to talk about the legal ramifications of it.
I'm happy to do it.
All right, man. Thank you once again, brother. That's it. Hey, guys, thanks for tuning in. I'm Tim Black. Don't forget to follow Mr. Christopher Brown. I'll put the links in the description box below. I'm Real Tim Black on Facebook and Twitter, and that's it. Have a good one. Thank you for tuning into the Power Hour with Tim Black. Find us at timblacktv.com. Business inquiries, client care at timblacktv.com. Information is power. Get some.